Welcome to the Honest Money Show. Thanks to our sponsor Bitaroo for making today's episode possible, Australia's biggest Bitcoin-only exchange. Hi Andy, hi, welcome to the Honest Money Show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you on. We both share a passion, which is superannuation funds and Bitcoin. So I thought it would be really, really great to have you on to talk about these things, because I know we're both quite engaged in the community in this space, and it's something that is very dear to my heart. So once again, thanks for coming on. I wanted to perhaps maybe start with helping Australians understand that there is an option for them to move their Bitcoin into super, why they should do that, and how to go about it. So perhaps let's start with the why. What is the performance that has happened in Bitcoin compared to the average superannuation fund in Australia?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I spend a lot of my days talking to clients of the Bitcoin Advisor and talking to them about retirement and superannuation. And fundamentally, it comes initially from a place of I'm a Bitcoiner and I want more Bitcoins. So people often look at the portfolio of wealth that they have or the money that they have, and superannuation is usually a kind of glaringly underused and misunderstood part of someone's portfolio. And when they understand that they want more Bitcoin, then it becomes a very obvious place to go and look and go, oh, well, how do I buy Bitcoin with my superannuation? In managed funds, they kind of average 8 to 12% per year. So performance isn't comparable to Bitcoin. Obviously, Bitcoin is more volatile, and that's a consideration. But fundamentally, there is always an option to be able to move your superannuation out of a managed fund, set up a self-managed fund, and then you can allocate to whatever you like, including Bitcoin. And so increasingly, lots and lots of people I speak to and work with are moving their superannuation out of those managed funds and into Bitcoin. And it's a lot more straightforward a process than most people think. It's not as complicated as it's made out to be. The kind of traditional wealth industry and accountants generally aren't very well educated on the current state of self-managed super and Bitcoin particularly. And so there's lots of kind of bad advice out there, or half-formed advice. So that's what we do at the Bitcoin Advisor, and with the website we created, bitcoinsuper.io, to help people understand what's possible, how to do it, how quick it can be, and how much you can invest, and what a good starting point looks like. And everyone's circumstances are different and unique and individual. And so, what's right for one person might not be right for another person, but more often than not, we find a lot of people are doing 100% allocation. To answer the question around performance, 8 to 12% in a managed fund, but Bitcoin's, compound annual growth rate is about 80% a year over the last 10 years. So it really is like 10 times outperforming the traditional managed fund industry. Past performance is no guarantee of future performance, but that kind of average over a 10-year period is the sort of period that managed funds measure themselves over as well. And so everyone thinks Bitcoin's very new. Well, it's been around 16 years, and that sort of performance over the last 10 years is a very good measure for comparing it against managed funds.
Yeah. And you helped me last year. Like, I remember having a chat with you in terms of the the mechanics of how to move my money across. But the story you might not know is what sort of sparked that desire in me. So I already had gotten into Bitcoin. Like, I had some money put aside for a business. I realized that the compound annual growth rate was going to be much better in Bitcoin than if I kept doing this business. So I moved some money across into Bitcoin. So I was already quote unquote a Bitcoiner. And then I was at a Sydney meetup and someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, at what price point are you going to move your super into Bitcoin? I'm like, you can do that? He's like, yes. So that's kind of where I learned that the only way to do it at the moment in Australia is through a self-managed super fund. I went through the process, and I can say, thanks to you, I have made in 1 year $83,169.91. That's insane.
It's amazing, right? Yeah.
That's insane. That's 1 year.
It just doesn't
I
even come
expect.
close to the managed funds. It's so far ahead. And, even with drawdowns, I quite regularly post a chart on X that basically shows that if, I think it was 2019, if you put $50,000 into Australian super and at the same time put $50,000 into Bitcoin through an SMSF, how would it perform each year? And I think the worst drawdown was something, I can't remember, something like 40 something percent. But basically, that $50,000 in 2019 in Australian super would turn to $76,000 by the time you got to the end of the previous financial year, so end of June just gone. And in Bitcoin, it would have gone from $50,000 to about $600,000. So it's not even, and that's even with a big drawdown in the middle. So yes, it's volatile, but it's volatile to the upside. We know that money is continually being debased, and therefore Bitcoin will continue to go up over the long term. And that makes it the perfect vehicle for a superannuation, because you're not going to touch that money until you're 60 or 67 or the point at which you reach preservation age. And so why not put it in the best performing asset class? And these things are never one-way streets either. You can always readjust later. One thing I'm quite happy with, I've been doing my self-managed super for about 4.5 years. I already have more in my self-managed super now than I would have had I stayed with Australian super and retired in 10 years' time, 11 years' time. And so now I can readjust that self-managed super portfolio, knowing that I've already got plenty in super that's going to last me through my retirement, and I can always reallocate. I'm not going to, because Bitcoin's still the fastest horse in the race, and I don't see that changing in any time soon. But fundamentally, it outperforms so much that even over 3 or 4 years, you're so far ahead of where you would ever be with a managed fund. It's almost silly not to. The risk is not being allocated to Bitcoin rather than being allocated to Bitcoin.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I've noticed I also feel a little bit more comfortable with the drawdowns in super than in my personal stash, because for me, that is very much the long term investment. Whereas I expect with my personal stash, at some point, I will want to sell some, not a lot, but we'll see. I don't know. At this point, I'm trying to hold for as many cycles as possible without touching it. But eventually, it kind of do want to live off my Bitcoin.
I honestly view it as a savings account. That's how I think about
Yeah.
Bitcoin, and I see my personal stash of Bitcoin as my savings account. And what's a savings account for? It's for spending on special events or rainy days or emergencies or something like that. So I'm not in the camp of never sell your Bitcoin. I believe, it's a savings account. And if you need to spend some of your savings, whether it's, taking your kids on holiday or buying a car that you always wanted or upgrading your house, then that's what it's for. Nobody wants their gravestone to have how many Bitcoin they saved. They want to be remembered for the great life that they had and the things that they enjoyed and the experiences they had with their family and friends. So for me, it's a savings account. And, Bitcoin in super is exactly that too. You're saving for your retirement, so that we often joke, who wants a soup and bingo retirement when you can have a champagne and caviar retirement? And Bitcoin will enable that. And I'm much more excited about retirement and having access to those funds than worrying about scrimping and saving and having a struggle in retirement. So super's all
Yeah.
about providing for a great retirement.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to travel. I want to go hiking. I want to live a good retirement, not, collect stamps and look at coupons and things like that. So I feel very good about that. But I wanted to ask you, there's a lot of women in the community who might not have a lot in their superannuation, whether it is by circumstance, such as they're a sole trader and therefore not putting as much away into their retirement, or they've taken time off for motherhood, again, had no income during that time. So if someone's got less than 50,000 in their superannuation, is that still a good opportunity for them to enter, I guess, a self-managed super fund with all the fees and annual audits
Yeah,
and things like that?
I think everyone's circumstances are slightly different, and there's probably 2 or 3 different scenarios there, which would be yes, no, or maybe. But certainly, we have clients who start with $20,000 and, they're on the beginning of their journey with superannuation and basically, it's a good opportunity to buy in with Bitcoin. The fees are, probably $1,400 a year for a super, so they're not that high. That's obviously a large percentage when your balance is only sort of 20, 30, 40 grand. But when the performance of Bitcoin is 83% a year, it really pales into insignificance. So often the kind of traditional accountancy or wealth advice you'd get is you need like $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 to do a self-managed super and make it viable because it's expensive. But I think that's outdated. Purely from the fact, they talk about fees, but generally when an accountant is talking about a self-managed super, it's usually where the client is going to be trading in and out of shares. They think they can do better than the managed funds. They're investing in all sorts of crazy things, and there's lots of transactions and complexity. And when you buy and hold Bitcoin, it couldn't be simpler. You're doing one purchase with your rollover out, which is your initial balance of however much you're moving in, plus then your compulsory contributions on a rolling basis. And so you might do like 12 transactions a year if you get paid your super monthly. Could even be 4 if you paid quarterly. So I think the rules around that are changing so that you have to receive super when you get your salary. But ultimately, it's not a complicated thing. And therefore, the performance dramatically outweighs the cost of doing it. And so it makes it cost effective at a fairly low amount of balance to be able to do this and provide you the best possible opportunity of growing your balance dramatically. So, to take 20 grand and add 83% and compound that over 8, 10, 12, 24 years before you retire, then, you're providing yourself a really significant opportunity for a decent retirement. So small amounts is absolutely possible. I think, a big nuance to this that I often talk about as well. I personally don't think it's a good idea to contribute to super anything other than what you have to. It's much better to stack Bitcoin outside of super than it is inside, but all of those funds that are compulsory and already there or going to be there through compulsory contributions, of course, allocate them to Bitcoin for the performance that you're going to get, but never make any discretionary contributions to super because I think the counterparty risk is too great. The government are moving the goalposts. They will continue to move the goalposts. They're looking at a $4.5 trillion pot of superannuation money, and they're working out as many creative ways as they can to try and get their hands on that to fund their profligate spending. So fundamentally, I would really say, in the sole trader example that you used, much better for that sole trader to allocate, company Bitcoin or personal Bitcoin than to start contributing to super when they absolutely don't have to, because that counterparty risk is just too great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with that. Before I got into Bitcoin, I did start thinking of allocating, like I was allocating additional contributions into my super because I didn't know of Bitcoin. I didn't use it as a tool. I didn't realize how powerful it was. So I was very much in that traditional finance mind where I was like, I need to have something decent to retire with. But now, like, my mind has completely shifted because I've seen the performance and it just doesn't make sense. And like you said, you're absolutely right. They do keep moving the goalpost. And it is so frustrating because when we look back at history, the reason why they set up superannuation in the first place was because to help people save for the retirement. And now they've turned around and gone, oh, look, there's this whole money, like, let's put our paws in it. And yeah, we can talk about some of the taxation changes, proposed taxation changes a little bit later on. But before we do, I wanted to maybe get into the mechanics. You do have a great resource on your website as to the step-by-step guide in how you can move your entire superannuation fund from your super fund into a self-managed super fund. And there's like about 10 steps from memory. Most of the steps are not done by you. They're done by your super admin, for example, but you kind of just need to be aware of where you are. And there are a couple of critical decisions that you as an individual have to make before you make that. And I think from memory, the first one is deciding whether you want to be set up as a family trust. Yeah, as a family trust or a corporate trust. So
we've recently kind of updated things on Bitcoin Super to make it even easier. We've partnered with a company called SMSF, a really great organization. They've set up thousands of self-managed super funds over the years, and just in the last sort of 6 months, we've started working a bit more closely with them. And so it makes it even easier. So there are a number of different ways you can set up an SMSF. We used to recommend eSuperFund, and there's still a great option. It's just much more kind of self-setup and lots of paperwork yourself. And with Udo now, basically they help do it all for you. So it's very much a hands-off process. They'll really step you through everything, hold your hand all the way through the process. It makes it a lot easier and quicker because they're very efficient at doing that. And the costs are very similar. So it's a really effective way of doing it. And really, what we tend to do is, introduce clients to Udo, and then basically they're taken through the process. And it takes about 4 weeks. And they'll talk you through whether it's a corporate trustee or a personal trustee. Generally, we recommend corporate trustee as the default because you can have a single member in the fund. Similarly, you can have up to 6 members in the fund. So we have quite a few clients who have husband and wife and adult children or parents in their fund as well. And that spreads the cost of that and maintenance of that fund. You do also obviously then look after your annual tax return and your audit and make sure everything functions properly and easily, and really makes it a very hands-off process. So generally very, very simple. As an individual, then you're just kind of responsible for when the compulsory contributions come in from your employer, making sure that they go to your exchange account, which is set up in the name of your super fund, and then obviously buying the Bitcoin and storing that however you want to store it. And again, that's something we help clients with as well, as the Bitcoin advisor, as collaborative security, but people are entirely free to kind of store their Bitcoin as they see fit. And again, that's kind of one of the unintended benefits of having Bitcoin in super. You're actually putting that money under your own custody and control. And so, if something dramatic happens, then potentially super funds in managed funds can lose value and disappear, or as happened even just a few weeks ago. I think it was $100 million collapse of an investment firm that was running a pretty sketchy superannuation process, and they basically ran off with everything. At least with Bitcoin in self-custody, you're looking after that yourself, and it's under your own control and your own keys, and makes you self-sovereign with your superannuation. So it's not at risk of someone walking off with it.
Yeah, and the double standards when this happens in traditional finance, it's very much hush hush. When it happens in Bitcoin, it's a completely different story. It's like Bitcoin is terrible and this and that, which just is not true. But on that, there actually have been a number of things in Australian headlines as to like super funds doing sketchy things. I know the case that you mentioned, but there was one as well earlier on this year where I think it was Hester, I want to say. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, they turned their systems off for like 6 months while they did a system upgrade. It's horrendous.
Was that Hester? Yeah. It just so many red flags for me, and I do feel a lot more secure having my own retirement in my own hands. And I do keep it very separate from my personal stash. So I've got separate wallets, separate accounts, separate everything. So don't muddy the waters. And I always advise people to do the same.
I think it alludes to a really important point, not just the stability or doing sketchy things or being run badly. If you actually ask your super fund, where are my funds invested, they'll give you very kind of top line allocations to Australian shares, US shares, fixed income, alternative investments, and other things. You actually have no idea where your money's invested. And even things like, I think Matt Barry did a tweet a couple of days ago, the entrepreneur in Australia, that he'd wandered around Australian commercial real estate looking for new office space, I think. And he said it was just a disaster in Sydney CBD. The offices he went into might have like 15% occupancy. Most of the floors are empty. They're discounting X, Y, and Z. Like the returns that those commercial real estate properties are earning are must just be dire. Now, who owns all of that commercial real estate? It's a lot of the superannuation funds. And so those superannuation funds are holding that commercial real estate at whatever valuation they put on them because they're self valuing them, and they don't have to revalue them. I think it's something like every 3 years at their own discretion. And so, that was all based on like 80–90% occupancy, which is clearly not the case anymore post-COVID, and will continue to decline with kind of advent of AI and everything else. And so whatever valuations those super funds are putting on the money that you've got invested with them, that's just one example of probably a bunch of bad investments that are overvalued, which means that, by the time you get to retirement, are those funds going to be worth the same amount of money as you think they are? Possibly not. And if there's, another 2008 style recession or economic collapse, that can destroy a lot of the value in your superannuation that isn't going to come back. And that's quite different with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is price volatile, but it's a nascent asset. But the amount of Bitcoin you hold will remain the amount of Bitcoin that you hold. And so as the cycles continue or price appreciations continue and the scarcity of Bitcoin, for me, it gives me an awful lot more confidence that I know how much Bitcoin is in my super. I know how much I'm adding to that on a regular basis. So I know how much Bitcoin I'm going to have by the time I retire. You can't say the same about the dollar value of your managed fund because you're not in control of any of that. And the valuations of some of these investments that they have are just garbage. So it's really concerning to me. And I think the risks of not doing it far outweigh the risks of doing it. And you begin to realize that more and more when you're on the other side of having done the move.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a huge red flag for them to be marking their own homework like that.
Yeah.
What could go wrong? Yeah, but I wanted to also ask you if for people who've already set up their SMSF as a family trust, is it fairly easy to switch to corporate later on when they decide that they want to do that?
Yeah, if it's a personal structure, then you can move it to a corporate structure. And obviously, any of the management firms can help you do that. I don't think it's a complicated thing to do. I generally, like I said, recommend a corporate trustee just up front. It's a little bit more cost, but you can pay that back to yourself out of your super. So it's only a temporary outlay. But yeah, you can certainly move from a personal trustee to a corporate trustee fairly easily. Yeah, it's not a complicated exercise.
Nice. Now let's maybe talk about how we can keep our superannuation for as long as possible, and let's touch on Division 296 because I know that's quite a big concern for a lot of people in Australia. I have been following the debates on all social medias, including Instagram and Twitter and LinkedIn, and it's interesting to hear both sides of the perspective and just how misinformed some people are.
Yeah, I think there's really a few moving parts to it. First and foremost, it's not been legislated yet, so everything's a little bit speculative until that legislation passes. If indeed it does in the current proposed form, we absolutely hope that they see sense before they make any stupid decisions. Clearly, the most contentious component of it is taxing unrealized capital gains. All tax is theft, and I'm pretty open about talking about that. But at the end of the day, unrealized capital gains tax is just egregious theft. You haven't realized that money, so they're asking you to pay for something that you haven't earned yet. So I think it's pretty bad, and the unintended consequences of that are significant. Obviously, it's on balances over $3 million, and so most people will be like, well, I'm never going to get to $3 million of super. Yep, fair enough. There's 80,000 people in the country apparently that do have a balance of greater than $3 million in their super, all the way up to hundreds of millions of dollars. And I don't think anyone, particularly argues that, okay, maybe we move from 15 to 30% tax rate on balances over 3 million. Okay, I don't agree with it, but at the same time, it's not the worst thing in the world. But to tax it when it's unrealized capital gains can cause some really significant problems. And we kind of gamed the numbers out. And if you had a $3 million balance of Bitcoin, because it's a volatile asset, it could cause some significant issues. So if Bitcoin did a 10x in a year, which doesn't seem unfeasible with the scarce supply, it's a possibility. It's certainly a non-zero possibility. So you would go from $3 million to $30 million. That would be a $27 million gain. And so you would be paying 30% tax on that $27 million, which would be about $8 and a bit million. If the following year Bitcoin's price crashed 80%, for example, you would then have a tax bill greater than the balance of your super fund, and you would have to declare insolvency. If you're then a company director, you would have to not be a company director anymore, so you would lose your job. And if you were holding a financial services license and that was the case, you would no longer be allowed to hold a financial services license. And so the unintended consequences for a Bitcoiner are quite dramatic. That's why kind of the unrealized capital gains component is just dreadful. The broader kind of superannuant cohort of farmers and other people who are wealthy, who have their farms in their super because it's the best place to keep them, to preserve generational wealth. In that instance, what does a farmer do if, who values their farm and says, well, your farm's now worth X amount more, so you owe us $1 million? Like it's a really egregious, problem. Does your auditor turn around to you and say, well, your farm is worth $15 million, and now it's worth $20 million because I say so? And then the next year, maybe it crashes. Like, do you have to sell like a quarter of a back paddock to cover a tax bill? Like the stated rules are that you have to have enough cash on hand to be able to do it. But, farming notoriously can be, a very wild set of swings in terms of cash flows. So it's going to cause all sorts of problems for that cohort. I just think generally speaking, it's terrible legislation. Hopefully, they see sense and remove the unrealized capital gains component. Ultimately, I'm glad my superannuation is in Bitcoin because it's under my control in my wallet, secured with my keys, and that gives me optionality should these sorts of things come to bear. So,
start saving in Bitcoin with Bitaroo, Australia's biggest Bitcoin-only exchange. Bitaroo offers easy tools and advanced features. Join thousands of happy users making their first Bitcoin purchase today. Download the app or visit bitaroo.com.au. Yeah, absolutely. I saw on Instagram, because I've been following this for a while now, and people were saying this only benefits the rich. They get tax breaks from super, and the way that it was worded, I thought it almost sounded like it's only the rich that get a tax break and nobody else. And it's quite like a manipulative way to state something, because that's absolutely not the case. Maybe they're the ones utilizing this, but it's available to everyone.
It's an incredibly socialist argument to say that a tax not levied is a tax break. It's an absolute nonsense. The law is the law. The tax rules are the tax rules. You pay what tax is due. Just because they could tax you more doesn't mean you're getting a tax break. It's an absolute nonsense. So you do often hear in kind of socialist media and on the news and other things they're getting a tax break of X millions of dollars. Well, they're not, because it's not levied tax. So it's just what the rules are. And so, to my mind, it is absolutely kind of a garbage argument to suggest that, just because you're getting 15% instead of 30%, that you're costing the government X amount of money. If you follow that argument through, anything less than 100% is a gift from the government. Well, we know that's not the case, and taxes are way too high as they are, because spending is too high as it is, which is why they're looking to tax more and more, because they keep spending more and more. You can see how badly the economy in the UK is going for all the same reasons that we're following them. So, all the argument about unlevied tax being a break is, to my mind, garbage, and I just don't accept it.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of UK, did you hear, like, I haven't verified this, but apparently now they are giving 4-year visas tax free to try to attract people back into the country. Is that true? Or I heard that
Yeah,
somewhere on social media.
New Zealand does something similar where it's a 4-year tax break on overseas income. So, there's plenty of wealthy people in Australia looking at what the Labor government are doing and going, well, I'm off to New Zealand for 4 years and I'll take a tax break. So, there's lots of incentives in different jurisdictions. And this is what, those socialist governments don't really consider is that, if the wealthy are taxed more, they have the freedom to move, and they do. Britain's example recently of how much capital gains tax they're taking has halved. They put the rates up, so all the wealthy people pissed off. Like it's just what happens. So I think a high tax environment is just catastrophic for the nation, I think.
Yeah. And there was a lot of naivety that I noticed in a discussion that I had with someone about this tax, and fundamentally boiled down to them saying, well, if more people get caught in this net in the future, the government's going to reverse it. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Like, look
Yeah,
at the
when
history
it
of taxation in Australia.
doesn't
It's
get
never
repealed.
reversed. It's
No.
never reversed. If anything, it just goes the other way. Um, but yeah, okay, so let's now dive into the transition to retirement. So for those people who are close to it, what is it that they need to know?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's not the most straightforward of systems. And there's kind of lots of rules around preservation age and whether you can be working or not, and how it works. And then obviously layering in the complexity of Bitcoin is quite interesting as well. But a lot of clients are nearing or in retirement, so we spend a lot of time talking to them about how to manage this. And one of the first questions is, well, Bitcoin doesn't generate a yield, and so how am I going to live on Bitcoin when I retire? Do I sell bits of it? Do I borrow against it? How do I do these things? And so we spend a bit of time talking about that. But initially, you can declare yourself retired in Australia at 60 years old, as long as you're not earning, and you can say to the ATO, I am no longer earning an income, and then you can transition to retirement. So before retirement, you are in accumulation phase, and post-retirement, you're in pension phase. And so there's something called the transfer balance cap, which is the amount of money that you're allowed to move from accumulation phase into pension phase tax-free forever. That currently sits at $2 million. And tends to increment in $100,000 units depending on inflation. So some years it might not go up. Other years, like this year, it just went up $100,000 from 1.9 million to 2 million. So I did some kind of take it with a pinch of salt mental arithmetic around what that would look like for me. And if I've got a pile of Bitcoin by the time I get to 60, I expect the transfer balance cap to probably be around $3 million by then, because it's about 10 years away, and it'll probably, with inflation, go up 100 grand a year. So we'll call it around $3 million by the time I retire. So you can take $3 million worth of Bitcoin and in kind transfer it into your pension phase, which means you can just take the Bitcoin and reallocate it over there. You don't have to sell it for dollars and buy Bitcoin back or anything like that. You can literally move it as Bitcoin out of accumulation phase into pension phase. Then one of the rules and the kind of social contract of superannuation, you have to spend 4% of your balance every year to live on. Now, you can spend more if you want, obviously, but you can't spend less than that. So, and that can't be in kind. So you do have to sell 4% of your pension holdings every year into cash and withdraw it into your personal account. Now, that doesn't mean you can't just buy Bitcoin again and hold that personally. But that sale of Bitcoin out of your pension, because it was under the transfer balance cap, is tax-free forever. So there's no capital gains tax paid on that transaction, and that will remain the case. So I thought, as a bit of mental gymnastics, using the compound annual growth rate of Bitcoin, which who knows if that continues, because it is, compared to other assets, very high. But who's to say it doesn't go higher with the scarcity of Bitcoin? But at the end of the day, like, what would it look like in 10 years? So if you moved 3 million into pension phase and you withdrew 4% a year and the compound annual growth rate continued, in 10 years' time, that 4% that you would have to withdraw would be about $4 million, and you would have about $100 million in your pension.
Challenge accepted. Like
I think so.
spending 4 million.
I'll have a crack.
I'll try my best. Yeah, yeah. I also wanted to ask you, before you joined the call, we briefly spoke about some of the legislation changes in the US and now the 401k, which is the superannuation equivalent in Australia. They can now purchase Bitcoin directly. How far do you think Australia is from that? Like, do you have?
It's a really good question. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And typically, Australia ultimately does follow what the US banking regulations do, because the Federal Reserve and the Treasury and the US government all set this legislation, and then the banks follow, and everything trickles down. And it would be highly unusual for Australia not to follow at some point. It may be slow, it may take a number of years or a decade, who knows, but I'd find it very strange that if US citizens were able to allocate their 401k to Bitcoin and do that however they liked, that we wouldn't follow suit, because their pension industry is about $45 trillion and ours is about $4.5 trillion. So it's 10 times larger over there, obviously a much larger population as well. Again, probably 10 times larger. So it's relative. But I think a lot of that forward thinking legislation out of the States should ultimately trickle down to Australia and become law here as well. But, we're actually ahead of the US because self-managed super lets you do it now anyway. So that makes life a lot easier. But there's obviously the news from, a bunch of months ago from AMP that they made a small kind of like $20-30 million allocation to Bitcoin. I'm sure that's, the best performing component in their managed funds. So, I'd be surprised if more don't follow suit as well anyway. So.
Yeah, I remember that. I forgot about it, but they invested in Bitcoin futures or something like a while ago. It was in the news once and then passed, and no one's really talked about it since.
Yeah, I think one of the guys who made that happen at AMP spoke at Bitcoin Alive earlier in the year. So, but yeah, I mean, look, it was a forward thinking moment for them, and I'm sure it's one of the best performing components they have. Like nothing else is performing like Bitcoin right now. So
yeah, that would have proved to be a wise move. It's interesting as well to see how slowly, but I am optimistic about changes in Australia, although it's happening very, very slowly. Like it was lovely to see an ASX listed company allocate. I think they've got 12 Bitcoin, I want to say, 12.99 is a figure I have in my mind, in their corporate treasury. So that's nice. I have a feeling that will be more companies that follow suit.
Yeah. And Monochrome are doing a really great job with their ETF as well. They're world leading in terms of in-kind redemptions and deposits. So that, again, is a great forerunner. I think we'll see more of that with the ETFs in the States. I think that's getting announced or being announced. But, in-kind redemptions then actually makes Monochrome a very viable method as an on-ramp and off-ramp for Bitcoin as well, particularly as, the banks are debanking people for wanting to buy Bitcoin. And I think that legislation also got signed in the US in the last 24 hours by Donald Trump that, they aren't allowed to debank you anymore. So I would expect that legislation also to trickle down to Australia and, hopefully get rid of some of these nonsense restrictions and limitations that the banks put in place. Combank limit you to $10,000 a month, I think, currently. And just before the FTX blow up a couple of years ago, they were about to launch the ability to buy Bitcoin, but they got cold feet when FTX blew up. So the hypocrisy of now not letting you spend more than $10,000 a month on Bitcoin is quite astonishing. And I think simple solutions to that sort of thing, they'll shout fraud from the rooftops, but I think crypto fraud is a small percentage of the fraud that gets perpetrated. And, if you're dealing with reputable Australian exchanges, then there shouldn't be any limitation. You ought to be able to white label yourself or whitelist yourself from any kind of onerous exemptions from you spending your own money how you want to. I mean, you could organize with a branch that, you want to go to Crown Casino and spend $100,000. They're not going to stop you. So why aren't you allowed to go and buy Bitcoin? It's crazy kind of legislation. So I think back to the previous point, hopefully that trickles down from the States pretty quickly too.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane because someone who does have, like, say they have $1 million to invest in Bitcoin, how long is it going to take them to move that money across if they're with Commonwealth Bank?
Yeah.
And if someone's been a customer with you for like 30, 40, 50 years, like it's really not a nice thing to, like, I've spoken to some people who are with the Combank and, well, not anymore because they moved for this very reason. Yeah, it's a big FU to your customers.
And I'm all for, minimizing fraud and making sure that people don't lose their money and everything else. But at the same time, I think the pendulum swung way too far in the wrong direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if it's going to like a regulated exchange, they do their own enhanced due diligence in house.
Yep.
So it just doesn't make sense. You are hurting small businesses, you're hurting individuals, and it just makes me remember that meme that we love to share. My money's in the bank. It's not yours. It's not money. It's not in the bank.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What else can we chat about? I'm just trying to think. Have we missed something, Andy?
I just think, one other point that we kind of touched on earlier, but is really important around females, doing this in terms of their superannuation. A lot of our clients are female, whether they're married or single mums or all different life experiences and situations. There's clearly an earning disparity for females and males, and like you mentioned earlier, that can be even more exaggerated when it comes to superannuation because of career breaks or maternity leave or raising kids or any number of different reasons. And so females generally do retire with much smaller super balances than their male partners or husbands or whatever. And so I've found, and we find that the females or ladies that we work with, it's an enormously empowering situation to be able to get your superannuation into Bitcoin and start performing at 80+% a year, and very quickly outperforming, their husbands and partners or friends. And it provides a real sense of stability and a massive reduction in worry about what life looks like in retirement, particularly when they have smaller balances to start with. Once you're past 3, 4, 5 years of having Bitcoin in self-managed super, the freedom and empowerment that gives you is really quite incredible. And I think more so than blokes investing in super in Bitcoin. I think it really does change people's lives, and I love nothing more than catching up with female clients and hearing how it's going and everything else. And I think you mentioned before we started talking that there are people out there who have done this and their husbands think they're mad and don't agree with them being a Bitcoiner, but then the price of Bitcoin appreciates, their superannuation appreciates dramatically, and it turns their husbands' heads, and they're like, holy shit, I think you're right. And then all sorts of crazy things start happening, and people really understand what's possible. So it's very exciting. I think it's a really freeing technology. I think Bitcoin as freedom is probably one of the most profound statements about Bitcoin. And that freedom is mental, physical, financial, and on so many different levels. And I see that, in reality every single day when I talk to clients who now don't worry about their retirement and know that there's going to be enough there to support them and their family for as many years as they're going to be around. And, just talking about that and the transition to retirement thing, you really need to budget for like 20 to 25 years of retirement. Like that's the average lifespan post-retirement. That's a long time. And when you look at a lot of these retirement calculators and they say, well, you need $500,000 or $600,000 in your superannuation to be able to retire comfortably. No way. It's like 3, 4, 5 million if you're going to have a decent retirement for 25 years, if you look at inflation and everything else. So, I take all of those guides with a big pinch of salt. And I think, seeing people comfortable knowing that their Bitcoin's going to outperform inflation and that they're going to have a comfortable retirement is so rewarding.
Yeah, I was going to mention that earlier on because that is one of the things that really, really frustrate me because I do keep seeing those things pop up as well as advice how much you need to have in retirement if you're a single versus a couple, and it was like around 600,000 for if you're a single, and there's no way that that is enough money for you, even if you have your mortgage paid off and you have like you don't, which most people don't, and most people will not by the time they retire because of the cost of living what it is now. There's just no way for us to be told repeatedly that this is enough money to retire on, I think is really, really dangerous. And it almost feels like there's some sort of like institutionalized gaslighting in a sense that you're meant to settle for less. This is what you should be happy with. And I want to be careful in how I word this because I know some people are going to retire with these sums and even less. And it is like a very frightening thought, but I don't want that to be the cause for us to say that 600,000 is enough for retirement for a single person. There's nothing, because to me that sounds like hurry up and die sooner and live poorly, like that in essence. Yeah.
And without trying to sound too conspiratorial, I've probably done a good job of that already. But that institutional gaslighting, if you look at it, these sorts of figures are produced by the industry bodies or associated entities. The industry funds or the super funds are performing at 8 to 12% a year. So you can't expect to have more than that because the amount that you pay in over your lifetime plus the performance that they deliver for you is only going to get you to those sorts of numbers. So of course they're going to say that's what you need in retirement. Their whole
Yeah.
industry and whole industry is predicated on making money out of your money to pay themselves lots of money. So they can't outperform or underperform massively. They're not incentivized to. If they underperform for a couple of years, they can be forced to close to new members and then rolled into another fund. So they're legislatively, they're encouraged to perform as a herd at 8 to 12% a year and not outperform because that causes others to underperform. And, they're all about a diversified portfolio and making sure that, all the risk is spread. It comes to probably maybe a final point. On diversification versus concentration, a lot of our clients have 100% allocation to Bitcoin. That's their choice. That's how they want to invest. It's the best performing asset. So why wouldn't you? But the traditional finance and accountancy industry, wealth industry will always say you need a diversified portfolio to protect your wealth. Well, that's all well and good. But if you don't have the wealth, you need a concentrated portfolio to achieve the wealth that you want. There's no point having a diversified portfolio if it's not growing sufficiently to support you in retirement. So, that argument for me is a dead argument. And I often use the anecdote of, Jeff Bezos isn't the richest man in the world because he had a diversified portfolio. It's because he had a concentrated portfolio of Amazon stock. And I think it's reasonably well documented anecdote that Bill Gates would have been the world's first trillionaire had he not diversified his portfolio away from Microsoft stock. But at Warren Buffett's advice, he did, and therefore he's not worth $1 trillion. He's worth a lot less. Now, he's still got more money than he'll ever need in 100 generations, but at the same time, I'm sure he would have liked to have been the world's first trillionaire. So the whole kind of diversification versus concentration portfolio argument, I think, is a nonsense as well, particularly when it comes
Yeah.
for 20 years. I might as well give it the best opportunity to become worth as much money as possible over the course of the next 10 years.
Yeah, I believe in Bitcoin's fundamentals, and to me, the way I understand it, it is a very safe asset. So it's probably one of the safest ones,
I think
and
stored
I'm
properly,
very
absolutely.
comfortable having. Yeah, well, the biggest risk to Bitcoin is me. um, so yeah, I definitely feel very comfortable having 100% allocation in Bitcoin in my super, and yeah, it's done very well for me so far. I am also expecting drawbacks. I'm comfortable with that, and yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been a great chat, very efficient, but we got a lot of ground covered. But how can people contact you if they have some follow up questions? What's the best way to reach you?
So I'm on X, Andy BTC Advisor. You can also Google the Bitcoin Advisor, bitcoinsuper.io, and we've just recently launched loanmycoins.com, which is a very new and innovative way to borrow against your Bitcoin with Bitcoin. So it works for a very particular trade, but you can find me under all of those things.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Loved having you on.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. That's it for this week on The Honest Money Show. Big thanks to Bitteroo. Check out why more Aussies are choosing them at bitteroo.com.au. And shout out to our listeners on Fountain, where you can earn sats just by tuning in. If you appreciate the way we cut through the noise, you can support us directly via the QR code in the episode notes. Until next week, take care of yourself and your money.